Hello everyone, this is Chapter 8's weekly video. First of all, go ahead and do what you always do and pull up my notes to Chapter 8 from Blackboard. And then when you get it up, we will start. Okay. You'll see the first slide has your assignment for this week, and I'm going to go ahead and you'll have Chapter 8 quiz, and then since we're getting close to the deadline for your due date for your observation report, I have not included a discussion board for this week. So you'll have Chapter 8 quiz, and then spend time on getting your observation reports finished up, as they are coming up quickly, November 17th. Okay, first of all, start out with a YouTube on communication. So if you will pause me and watch the YouTube on communication. Okay, well, I hope that gave you an idea, a little bit of what you're going to be looking at. If you've already read the book, then it gives you a little bit more information. If you haven't read the book, then it lets you know what you're get to look forward to in reading Chapter 8. Some of the next slides are more of a review in some of the sections you have, so go through that and see if you can remember what they are. I went ahead and left them in there. And then you get to the Chapter 8 communication disorders slide. And first of all, when you get done with this chapter, you'll be able to identify and provide examples of 4 major functions of communication. You'll be able to describe the characteristics of each of the following communication disorders. There's speech sound errors, there's fluency disorders, voice disorders, and language disorders. Along with the next one, you've got describe. You'll be able to describe and identify causes of primary types of speech language impairments. You'll be able to list the major components of a comprehensive evaluation used to detect the presence of the extent of a communication disorder. You'll be able to identify the basic goals and common elements of effective interventions for speech sound errors and language disorders. And finally, you'll be able to explain how the speech language pathologist's role changes as a function of the setting in which a child with communication disorders is served. Next, we have some of the definitions. Communication, and some of you, if you remember your high school public speaking class, you might remember parts of this. Communication is the interactive exchange of information, ideas, feelings, needs, and desires. Communication involves a message, a sender who expresses the message, a receiver who responds to the message, and then there's functions of communication. You've got narrating, explaining or informing, requesting, and also expressing. Then there's a language is a formalized code that a group of people use to communicate with one another. And there are 5 dimensions of language. Some of these you probably remember from your high school days. You do need to remember the ones in red. You will be definitely seeing some test questions on that one. You have phonology, you have morphology, you have syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And then dialects are also learned patterns of speech and language appropriate to families and communities. And we'll be discussing some of that also. Also, the next slide, I just wanted to include in there from a past slide. Language includes not only sounds, but also letters and elements of sign language. So I wanted you to realize that. Then some more definitions. Speech is the oral production of language, and speech sounds are the product of 4 related processes. There's respiration, breathing that provides power. There's phonation, which is the production of sound by muscle contraction. And there's resonation, sound quality shaped as it passes through the throat, mouth, and sometimes the nasal cavities. And then finally, articulation, which is a formation of recognizable speech sounds. Sorry about that. My computer is reminding me to work on this. The next one, how do definitions of speech-language impairment relate to one another and to typical language development? Why don't you take a second and write down on a piece of paper what your thoughts are. How do definitions of speech and language impairments relate to one another and to typical language development? And then go ahead and pause and write down what you think. Okay. Well, first of all, language is a formalized code used by a group of people to communicate with one another. We just went through that about a couple slides ago. And then speech is the oral production of language, fastest and most efficient method of communication by language, also one of the most complex. Typical speech and language development. Most children follow a predictable sequence in the acquisition of speech and language skills. Children between the ages of 11 and 36 months of age are exposed to a tremendous amount of spoken language. Children who are learning to talk practice their new skill relentlessly. And I know my grandson, there are times when I want to say, be quiet. But no, he's in that stage right now, trying to mimic and trying to come up with words. So bridging the 30 million word gap is a reference to the vast difference in a number of words that some children from poverty background hear by age 4 compared with experiences of more affluent children. So that's something to think about also. Then there's two different disorders defined. There's communication disorders defined. There's two different definitions. There's ASHA definition, which is an impairment in the ability to receive, send, process, and comprehend concepts or verbal, nonverbal, and graphic symbol systems. And then there's the IDEA definition, a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects the child's educational performance. That last few words you should recognize by now. As I said earlier, you're going to hear that, and that's going to have to be what's involved with anybody that has an IEP, is that adversely affects the child's educational performance. One other question that I thought was good to keep in here around this time is, when does a communication difference become a communication disorder? When does a communication difference become a communication disorder? And basically, when a communication difference involves the extent of impact on one's life, it becomes a communication disorder. The next one, we're going to start talking about speech impairments. Speech is an impairment when it deviates so from the speech of other people that it calls itself attention to itself, interferes with communication, or provokes distress in the speaker or listener. So speech is impaired when it deviates so from the speech of other people that it calls its attention to itself, interferes with communication, and provokes distress in the speaker or listener. And there are three types of speech impairments. They are articulation disorders, which are errors in the production of sounds. There's fluency disorders, which are difficulties with the flow or rhythm of speech. And then there's voice disorder, which are problems with the quality of one or use of one's voice. And then there's language disorders. Language disorder is impaired comprehension and or use of spoken, written, and or other symbol systems. A language disorder may involve in any combination the form of language, which is phonology, morphology, and syntax. Again, you all will want to read into those and make sure you have an understanding of all those five. The content of language, which is semantics, and or the function of language, which is the pragmatics. A lot of times when you hear discussion of a student with autism, you will hear that they are looking at pragmatic language, and that's what this part here is. Language disorders may involve receptive or expressive disorders. The characteristics of speech sound errors: you have distortions, substitutions, omissions, and also additions. And then there's articulation disorders. A child is not able to produce a given sound physically because that sound is not in his repertoire. I know when I was growing up, I was a child that was born with a cleft lip and palate, and I had many years as a speech person working on my S's and my T's and all sorts of letters. Finally, in middle school, they decided that I did not need speech anymore and was exited from that program. So understand that well. There's phonological disorders. A child has the ability to produce a given sound and does so correctly in some instances, but not in others. Some of the characteristics: fluency disorder is an interruption in the flow of speaking characterized by atypical rate, rhythm and repetition in sounds, syllables, words, and phrases. Stuttering and cluttering are examples of fluency disorder. There's also a voice disorder. A phonation disorder causes the voice to sound breathy, hoarse, husky, or strained. And resonance disorders results in hypernasality or hyponasality, and you'll want to know the difference between those also. Another one that I wanted to put in here: positive reinforcements and confidence building are some of the typical effective treatment for fluency disorders. And I know we had an instance where I was working with a student at one point that had a stuttering problem, or at least that's what we thought, and that's how it came out. But as we talked to the speech and language pathologist, what was really going on is the brain, he was trying to say it so quickly that his brain is basically his fluency couldn't keep up. And so what they worked with this student on was slowing down his speech. And that way what he was thinking would actually help him out a little bit, and it would come out. And it actually helped. So, just something to think about. I never really thought about that as an option, but that's what was going on. Characteristics of language disorders. Language disorders involve problems in one or more of the 5 dimensions. There's phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Language delay implies a child is slow to develop linguistic skills, but acquires them in a typical sequence. So they're acquiring them in the order that you would expect if you were looking at language, but it's slow to develop. Language disorders suggest a disruption in the usual rate and or sequence in which specific language skills emerge. The next one I want you to go ahead and think about. I'm going to read this question and go ahead and write down what your thoughts are. What basic types of communication disorders might make statements such as "the dogs run home" and "that foop is dude" signal? What basic types of communication disorders might make statements such as "the dogs run home" and "that foop is dude" signal? And the answer: the problems likely signal an error in articulation of speech. However, children's words and sentences often differ from adults' forms while children are learning language. As they progress, children will gradually replace incorrect word and sentence structure. The prevalence. In 2012-2013 school year, about 1,356,000 children ages 6 to 21 years received special education, in related services under the IDEA category of speech and language impaired. It is actually the second largest disability category under IDEA. Approximately 2/3 of school-age children served by SLPs are boys. Don't know, it seems like in the last few chapters, almost everything, there seems to be a prevalence of boys over girls. So another one. About 50% of children who receive special education services because of a primary disability also have communication disorders. The percentage of children with speech and language disorders decreases significantly from the earlier to the later school grades. There's 2 slides in there that you can skip over or you can look at, but it's there. Causes of speech impairments. There is cleft palate, paralysis of the speech muscles, absence of teeth, craniofacial abnormalities, enlarged adenoids, traumatic brain injury or TBI, and dysarthria. Also include in language disorders, you've got developmental and intellectual disabilities, autism, traumatic brain injury again, child abuse and neglect, hearing loss, structural abnormalities of the speech mechanism, aphasia, genetics, and environmental influence can also be a cause of language disorder. I have another question for you to answer, and then we'll talk about it. What are the major components of a comprehensive evaluation to detect the presence and extent of a communication disorder? What are the major components of a comprehensive evaluation to detect the presence and extent of a communication disorder? Write that down and see what your thoughts are. Well, first of all, first line of assessment involves universal screening and teacher observations. Most times, schools, as they get ready for students who come into kindergarten, or maybe their ECSE program, will involve a screening procedure. And part of that is going to be a speech language screening and also teacher observations. And if a child is suspected of having communication disorder, an SLP or speech language pathologist will conduct more systematic tests. Identification and assessment. We just talked about screening and teacher evaluation, but let's look at the evaluation components. Case history and physical examination, articulation, hearing, phonological awareness and processing, vocabulary and overall language development, along with assessment of language functions, language samples, and an observation in natural settings are what you're going to look for and what you're going to do when you're looking at different evaluation to identify and assess whether they have a speech or a language disorder. Assessment of children who are culturally diverse. And this is what can be tricky. Assess language proficiency in both the first and second languages when determining a culturally and linguistically different child's communication competence. Do not diagnose with a speech-language disorder if problems are observed only in English and not in their first language or dialect. Include assessment of basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. An assessment for the purpose of identifying children with disabilities are required by IDEA to be conducted in the child's native language. It's just similar to the other items that we talked about. Some of the educational approaches that you'll discuss in the book, there's articulation and phonological errors, which includes discrimination and production activities. There's fluency disorders, which are behavioral principles and self-monitoring. Voice disorders, you're going to use medical examination and direct vocal rehabilitation. And language disorders, they're going to use vocabulary building, naturalistic interventions. And then when you talk about augmentative and alternative communication, it's a diverse set of strategies and methods. And I want you to look over the AAC, or augmentative and alternative communication. Look over that a little bit more in your book. We're going to talk about it next, but I want to make sure you understand that one. ACC refers to a diverse set of strategies and methods to assist individuals who cannot meet their communication needs through speech or writing. ACC entails 3 aided or unaided components: a representational symbol set or vocabulary, a means for selecting the symbols, and a means for transmitting the symbols. And a symbol sets and symbol systems for ACC. Selecting the symbols and transmitting the symbols are the ones under ACC, or augmentative and alternative communication. The next one is another question I want to see if you know the answer to. What are the basic goals of effective interventions for speech sound errors and language disorder? Again, what are the basic goals of effective interventions for speech sound disorder, for speech sound errors, and then also language disorder? Take some time and go ahead and read that, and then come back. Well, hopefully one of them is to teach children to communicate with a variety of other individuals and across a variety of circumstances. Another one, children need to be around children and adults with something interesting to talk about. That's why it's good for preschool kids to be around other kids so that they can listen, and other adults so that they can hear and listen and try to come up with those words and learn the language. Language is an interactive, interpersonal process and naturally occurring intervention. Now I want to talk about the placement options. In 2011 and 2012, 87% of children with speech language impairments were served in the general education classroom. So preponderance of the students are served in the regular ed classes. They will go out as like a pull-out or some different models that they will get their speech or language instruction. Only 6% are in resource rooms and 4% in separate classrooms. Some examples of the service delivery models to those students are monitoring, pull-out, collaborative consultation, classroom or curriculum-based, separate classroom, community-based, and then accommodation. And so I do want you to look at, and you'll need to understand some of those different delivery models, as we'll discuss some of them in some of the other areas also. And then next, I want you to look at the DESE qualifications. I think you'll be interested to find out how you and what you need to find out in order to use IDEA to say that they have one of these. And there's 4 different ones. There's speech, which is fluency. There's also speech voice, which I haven't had too many that had the speech voice disorder, but it's on there and it's interesting to read. Language impairment, and then a sound system disorder, which is articulation and phonology. So if you click each one of those and look at, I know I just clicked the eligibility for speech and fluency, and you'll see it's a little bit over a page. You'll see the different behaviors of disfluency. You'll see the speech sample that they need to get for the evaluation, the number of rate of disfluencies, and there's also professional judgment and the evaluation report. So look through those 4 to get an idea of the differences of, because like I say, most of the class right now is regular education students. So you will have a preponderance of these, 87% of these students with speech or language disorders are going to be seen in your classroom. So you'll want to get an idea of the delivery models and what it's all about. Anyway, remember, if you have questions on your observations, please get with me before you finish writing it and turning it in. And before there's no time left for you to do maybe a little more observation if you didn't get what you needed. But now's the time to ask questions. So good luck on Chapter 8, and I look forward to reading your observation reports here in a couple weeks.